Welcome to the Literati Scene with Smokey Bacon and Dick Concannon, and co-hosts Suzanne McDonald and Joanna DiTillo. So stay tuned.
Our guest today is Kenneth Calhoun, who is a professor at LaSalle College, and he's a specialist in more the artistic end, but now he's a novelist. His debut novel is called Black Moon. You picked a very interesting element to catalyze your story. To me, it's cruel and unusual punishment. But tell us what got you started with Black Moon.
I hope you mean that the story is cruel and unusual, but not reading the story.
No, not reading the story, but the poor individuals
Right.
who are involved.
Well, it started because I did have a lot of people in my life who were struggling with sleep. And I don't know, you guys have probably noticed as well that more and more people are struggling with sleep on a daily basis, or a nightly basis, I guess it would be. So I also had a personal relationship with someone, a woman I was living with, who couldn't sleep with any real consistency. And so that became the kind of foundational idea. If you just take an idea like that, a kind of commonplace struggle, and then kind of blow it out, extrapolate it into what ifs. You know, what if this was something that everyone was affected by? What if no one could sleep? Or in that scenario, what if maybe one or two people could sleep and the others couldn't? What would that mean culturally? What would that mean for society? And that's the beginning point of this kind of exercise of what ifs if there was an insomnia epidemic.
Well, it's like I immediately thought of Camus' The Plague,
Yes.
but this is not something that you can deal with directly because we really don't know. And one of the more interesting part of the story was the great amount of speculation on how this happened. Give us a few of those.
Well, there is a kind of almost a poetic contemplation by one of the characters about what could have caused it. So it starts, each line almost starts with maybe. Maybe it was this. Maybe it was the ice melting. Maybe it was the towers falling. Maybe it was the policy of preemptive war. Maybe it was a variety of scenarios that this person goes through as he contemplates the possibilities. What I meant for that to do in the book is to provide a swarm of red herrings. Just a whole kind of a plague of possibilities, let's say, about what could have caused this, so that the reader starts to realize this isn't a book about solving this particular central problem of insomnia. Instead, this is a book about relationships and the aspects of humanity, the things that make us human, in the face of the disintegration of some very specific elemental aspect of our lives.
The lack of sleep in your characters turns them almost brutal. Tell me, how did you come to that conclusion that someone without the ability to sleep would become an angry person, so angry that they get violent?
Right. Well, again, it's kind of an extrapolation or an exaggeration of what you might see when you have not had sleep yourself. You find yourself getting cranky or a little more short-tempered. So again, I was just, what if that was played out to extremes? And I think that it's not scientifically sound maybe, but it's likely that people that are deprived of that kind of elemental rest would turn violent in the face of possibly seeing other people having that kind of rest, and it would be an envy or resentment that is exaggerated to the point of violence.
One other element that your story brought up, if we had a cyber war, is Black Moon a precursor of what will happen to us?
A cyber war. I think that that is a possible scenario that is kind of touched on in some of those contemplations. What I think we're doing as a culture with our constant engagement with connectivity and devices, hyperconnectivity, is eroding a sense of a day that's divided into a part of the day where you're conscious and working, and another part where you're resting and you're restoring yourself. That part that is the rest and restoration aspect of society, where we sleep at night traditionally, is being eroded by constant connectivity. So the cyber aspect of our lives is, I think, in some way a contributing factor, and it could be the cause of this epidemic, although, as you pointed out, I'm not saying what it could actually be.
Well, tell me another element that you considered was, with a lack of sleep, the language of the individuals starts to diminish. Tell us how you came to that conclusion.
Well, one of the things that I experienced myself when I lived in Spain for a year, and my Spanish is pretty poor, and what I noticed is as the day wore on and I got increasingly tired, my Spanish would get worse. And I could find that my ability to really control my language is directly affected to, how rested I was. And so again, I think that's what I was doing with that idea, and trying to turn that idea into something that is a condition of this particular kind of insomnia, where the language erodes. But I also like the idea of language being scrambled and being, kind of non-linear and maybe more poetically delivered. I've had conversations with people who have, say, Parkinson's, or some various forms of maybe Alzheimer's, and a lot of the language they use is just almost poetic in some way. It's so kind of disconnected and non-linear, but filled with images and poetry. So I tried to have that in my character speech.
All right, well, before we go, I didn't find a resolution in your book. Does that indicate you've got another one in mind?
I didn't really anticipate writing a sequel to Black Moon, although a lot of people have asked this question because they feel that there are some loose ends. What I find in the book, or what I try to create in the book, is that the loose ends are actually, there is some resolution to those loose ends. They're just very subtle, kind of more psychologically interior kind of resolutions with the characters, rather than the larger plot being resolved in terms of this mystery of the insomnia epidemic being solved, or a hero emerging that is going to explain all of this to us. I didn't want it to be that kind of book, so I had the resolutions be more about people deciding whether or not they can continue on without those they've lost, or if that they were now in a new state of existence without sleep. So that to me was the resolution.
So if our viewers wish to follow this up, do you have a website?
I do. My website is kennethcalhoun.com, and I'm also on Facebook and Twitter. And the paper book comes out in January, so I hope to be doing some kind of video or viral promotion for it. So if they visit the site, they'll find some news on that.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Literati Scene. I'm Suzanne McDonald, co-host with Smokey Bacon and Dick Concannon. Today we have author Connie Johnson Hambley, author of The Charity. Now, Connie has had over 25 years of business experience, primarily in the Boston area, spanning finance, banking, law, and especially entrepreneurial initiatives, and with her husband as well. She's also had a stint as a featured writer and columnist for Bloomberg Business Week. Excellent. Connie grew up in a small farm, dairy farm, north of New York City. And when she was 9 years old, an arsonist burned her family's barn to the ground. This terrifying incident shaped an experience that brought her to her writing, where she's grappled with this horrendous loss and brought us all to the heart of darkness in her novel. Welcome, Connie.
Well, thank you, Suzanne, and that was a very powerful introduction, and I appreciate that introduction. You know, so many people ask me, where does the idea for your book come from? And I have to say that, you know, my book is a fictional thriller, and the initial spark for the idea came when my backyard was on fire. My family was pillars of the community, and for some reason someone took exception to them. And an act of, you know, unspeakable evil, you know, happened to a good family. And it was at that point in time that I began to think, you know, good things happen to bad people, and what else do we see in our everyday world that might not be what we think it is? And that was really the beginnings of the stories of The Charity.
Yes, because in the book itself, even though it's a fast-paced, suspenseful novel, you have people saying it's a page-turner, can't put it down, I couldn't put it down. It's a phenomenal book, and you do race through it. But there are elements of darkness that are very evident, but also hidden. And you're saying that to the reader that in an everyday life, things may not be as they seem. There are darker undercurrents.
Yeah, exactly. My book tells the story about a young woman who uncovers the business and the money behind a terrorist cell. And as you said, I was, you know, worked in Boston in financial industry and in law, and those elements come into the book. And I think what makes a good book for a reader is having a book that's really well grounded in reality so that the readers can feel very much immersed in the story. So what I've tried to do is weave a suspenseful tale that has absolute truth behind it. It's a work of fiction, but when people come away from the book, they feel, oh, I know where you were. I know the Swan Boats in Boston. I know Copley Center. I know the North Shore of Massachusetts or in Kentucky. So it helps heighten that realism and heighten that reader expense for them.
Absolutely does. And then for listeners, certainly in the Boston area, the location, at least the beginning of the location, is on the North Shore of Boston. And then we travel to Kentucky and out to Ireland as well, where we confront the charity, the cell.
Absolutely.
But the other thing is the study in contrast, because you have Jessica, the so-called heroine, in a sense, who is a positive figure, an innocent figure, and yet she gets thrown into, as I say, the heart of darkness, and just by the sheer innocence of who she is. But she's also running away, and as she runs away, she gets further and further.
Absolutely. And again, what I wanted to do is create a character that readers could really identify with. And Jessica is resourceful, but she's not one of these superheroes that you might see in a thriller. She is a very real person, and the circumstance and the predicaments that she gets in are very real, and they're also very dark. They show the darker side of Boston. And as we sit here in Beacon Hill, not that long ago, we had a terrible act with the Marathon bombing incident that happened. And when you look at the faces of the alleged bombers in that, they look like normal 20-year-old college kids. You wouldn't think that they were capable of that. So what I'm doing with my book is taking a face of innocence or something that is bucolic, like the North Shore of Massachusetts, and I'm weaving it back behind the closed doors and in those secret conversations where the business that goes into supporting terrorist cells happens. And it is in the North Shore of Massachusetts and Kentucky, and those are big horse worlds, and that too is a very strong theme in the book.
Absolutely. Well, there are so many elements. You've got the horse racing, the family, it's steeped in the horses, then various elements of Jessica's life, and then the larger issues of who she's dealing with. And how is it that you chose the IRA as the terrorist organization? Because this was meant to be pre-9/11.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned that. It is pre-9/11, and I use the IRA as the terrorist entity because it doesn't immediately trigger in a lot of people that same bias that if I said Al-Qaeda. So I'm working with getting a galvanizing reading experience within the book. I'm using the reader's biases. So when I mention the IRA as a terrorist entity, a lot of people don't assume the IRA is a terrorist entity because they look at them as perhaps freedom fighters or people looking for unification of Ireland. So not only am I allowing the reader to sit on their own fence and make their own decisions, but I'm also using the history and the people of the IRA to bring to life the conflict of what would bring that person up to the act of terrorism. What makes a person want to do something so awful?
Connie, this is a riveting book. I wanted to ask you about how you chose the title as well, the charity, because I know that circles back in, but I would have to leave it to the readers too, and the listeners. Now, tell us how we can find you.
That's right. I have a website, ConnieJohnsonHambley.com, and Connie is CONNIE, Johnson, JOHNSON, Hambley, HAM as in man, B as in boy, LEY.com. The book is on Amazon, it's on Barnes & Noble, your local bookseller can also order copies through their services.
I might mention that Connie is a local writer. She's on the North Shore as well.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Connie.
This has been an absolute pleasure, Suzanne. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's been a treasure to have you.
Thank you.
Our guest today is Ingrid Thoft, whose latest work is called Identity. And this is a Fina Ludlow novel.
Yes.
Is this number 2?
This is novel 2.
Number 2. Fina in the book is a private investigator.
Yes.
And in reading the book, I wanted to find out what makes this different from all the other private investigators novels that we have. And we start off first, she's a female.
She is.
And there aren't that many private investigators that are female. But what I found was probably what makes your book so interesting is just the initials, PI. We have a private investigator who investigates not only for her work, but she investigates her brother, she investigates her family, she investigates people. It's a very interesting book. Tell us, how did you get started with this private investigation?
Well, I started, initially I had written an amateur sleuth series, and what I found was that was very limiting because you end up with what I call the Cabot Cove syndrome, which is that you have bodies dropping in a small town and you can't really explain why that is. So I decided I wanted to make the transition to a professional investigator, and I enrolled in a program at the University of Washington in private investigation and earned a certificate, and that was how Fina was born.
Well, you know, in your book there are some other PIs. One is personal injuries. She is injured during the entire book.
Yes.
Tell us, how do you work that into your story?
Well, I don't think that just the men should be the ones who are engaged in fisticuffs, essentially. It's part of her job, and it's a big part of who she is in terms of being a Ludlow. They are a scrappy family. That's how she was raised, and she doesn't shy away from physical confrontations. I think people are often a little taken aback because she is a woman and she engages in the physical confrontations. I think if she were a man, people probably wouldn't think twice about it, but because she's a female, they are concerned for her in a way they might not be otherwise.
Another PI, parenting institutions. You deal with an institution that is the catalyst for all parenting, which is sperm.
Yes.
Tell us how you got involved with that, because that is a large part of your story.
I'd like to start with a concept that has a lot of potential for interesting questions, and I think that parenting and parentage is an area where there are a lot of opportunities. And I was reading articles about how this group of children conceived that way are coming of age, and they are finding that the lack of regulation in the United States is rather problematic. There are now men who are finding out that they fathered upwards of 75 children with a variety of mothers. And I thought that that was appalling and fascinating and posed all kinds of interesting questions that this generation that's coming of age will have to deal with. And I like thinking about things about nature versus nurture and what makes a family and what really matters in terms of parenting and family and the relationships between children and their parents. So I think that people can relate to it regardless of their own family dynamic or structure.
Another is people investigations. You got involved with someone who really wasn't interested in money, but was rather interested in a bodily part.
Yes. That's
Tell
right.
our
That's
viewers
right.
about that.
Well, there is a character who looks up her long-lost niece, and as it turns out, we won't give too much away, she in fact has a hidden agenda or a secondary agenda. And to me that was fascinating because I like books that ask questions that I then as a reader answer or ponder, think about. And I think it raises interesting questions about what would you do for your family member? What would you do for a family member who you've just learned is a family member, who you've just learned is someone to whom you're biologically connected? And I think that is something that people think they know how they might respond, and yet when they actually find themselves in that position, their response might be quite different.
You know, let's get back to your private investigator, Fina.
Yes.
She is probably one of the more active personalities. She goes from one situation to another 24 hours a day. But one thing that would be interesting to our viewers is that she's from this area.
Yes.
Tell us, you deal, first of all, entirely with, other than an exception or two, with the greater Boston area.
I do. Well, I'm from Marblehead originally, and when I was writing Fina, I had moved to the Seattle area recently. And what I found was that I didn't know Seattle well enough nor feel comfortable enough with the city to have that be the setting for the book. But I did feel that I knew Marblehead and the North Shore and Boston enough to do that in Metro West area. What I also found was that it allowed me to be home in my mind while I was writing, even though I was living in Seattle. So it was a really nice transition making that move across country, because every day when I was working in my head, I was still in the Boston area.
Before we go, another PI, provisions institutions.
Okay.
You discuss food,
Oh yes.
particularly
The food issue.
FINA,
Yes.
who goes from junk food, then there are vegans, and then there are restaurants. It carries through your entire book.
It does.
Tell us about that.
Well, I love food, so it's something I enjoy in life, and I like to write about it. It's been very interesting to see readers' reaction to her diet. Some people are very critical, and some people wish they could have that diet. But I think part of great books take you to a place that you wouldn't necessarily go. I couldn't eat that way, and I like having a character who can.
Well, tell us if our viewers wish to follow up on this. Do you have a website?
I do. It's ingridthoft.com, and I can also be found on Facebook and Twitter.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you for
Thank
being
you.
on the show.
Thank you very
And
much.
good luck to you on your tour.
Thank you for joining us tonight. This has been the Smoky Bacon and Dick Concannon Show.